Thank you, Hillary. Appreciate the introduction. My name is Mark Azzolina, and I am the Director of Cybersecurity for Six Dimensions. And I certainly do want to welcome you to our presentation today. I'll be speaking about building a risk-driven information security management program. If you can, please type in your questions during the presentation. We'll try to get to them at the end. If we don't get to them at the end, we will certainly make sure that we send out an email answering all your questions afterwards. So again, thank you very much for attending, and we'll start the presentation now. A little bit about what we'll talk about today. First, I'll give you a little bit about my background. I'll discuss exactly why I believe this presentation is important. We'll talk about where to start building an information security management program. We'll start with the process and start with risk management and how risk management leads to building your information security management program. We'll talk about various security standards and how they might be able to be used to select various security controls that will be used to mitigate risk within your particular environment. And then we'll discuss monitoring the information security management program and therefore risk in the organization. And last but not least, we'll talk about some tips for small to medium-sized businesses. A lot of organizations today don't necessarily have the resources or don't have the luxury of throwing a lot of people and resources at building an information security management program, but it's still important to understand the concepts that are going to be presented today. So I'll provide some tips on how you might be able to use some of the concepts today in a small to medium-sized environment. But again, it's important to understand the concepts. It's very similar to flying. If you're flying a 777 or a small prop plane with a few passengers, you need to understand the concepts of flight and the physics behind flight. So very similar to information security management programs and risk management. A little bit about myself. I am what they call gray hair. I've been around for a long time, 32 years, going on 33 pretty soon, and been doing a lot in IT operational management, information security management. Really started my career at the Pentagon in the Air Force, where I had to work in an IT environment for very classified systems. So had to really live with the security controls and security requirements that were imposed upon us. Became a DoD contractor and started managing a lot of IT operational activities, and again in a classified environment, so had a lot of security requirements imposed on us, so I had to implement, monitor, and maintain those security controls. So I got a good broad understanding of a security program in total. So hopefully I'll be able to share that information with you today. Authored various policies in numerous regulatory requirements. I've been a CISSP since 2000 and an ISSMP since 2005. For those of you who may not be familiar with ISSMP, it is a concentration for Information System Security Management Professional. Didn't want anybody confusing me with the technical individual who has a lot more talent than I do. I can't configure a firewall or look at firewall rule sets, but I can build security programs. Why this webinar is important? Well, first of all, we realize and see that a lot of today's security breaches are due to long-known vulnerabilities. Organizations, they're hacked, they have a security breach. Sure enough, it's due to something that's been known for quite a long time, should have been remediated, but they did not take that step to do that. I've also done a lot of security assessments, and we'll go into an organization and we'll find a lot of deficiencies. We'll help them remediate those deficiencies, and we'll leave that engagement feeling very good about what we've done for our client. We'll come back a year later, and sure enough, we find some of the same deficiencies and vulnerabilities we found in the first audit in the follow-up audit. How do these vulnerabilities creep back into the system? And we'll see that an information security management program can actually pull this together and make sure that that doesn't happen. We're also faced today with a changing threat environment, and that's due to two things, really, new technologies as well as a changing world. What are the risks associated with that? We see social media, mobile devices, cloud services. All these things are very good and provide great business functionality, but unfortunately they also present a vulnerabilities with each of those. And those all have to be addressed, and we need to address that within the context of a full program. We also see that there are world events like hactivism, cyber warfare, and naturally crime. We have organized crime who are trying to access information so that they can do this for monetary gain. We have various types of states around the world that are trying to hack into particular infrastructures, making sure that they can get the upper hand in a cyber war if we are ever to engage in one, or they were to engage in one. And then hacktivism, for those of you not familiar with the term, hacktivism is actually hacking for a political gain. We've seen this with groups like Anonymous, when there was the G4 summits or G8 summits in Chicago. They hacked into the police department and others to wreak havoc and to actually spread their message and their political agenda. Security controls that are placed and they are not done in the context of a full-blown security management program can also lose their potency. They may not be as effective or as efficient as you would like them to be. So you want to make sure that you build things around those security controls that will keep those security controls running at maximum capability. We also see that a lot of security professionals nowadays, they tend to focus on technical security controls but not necessarily understand the information security management program. In other words, they're examining trees but they have no idea about the health of the forest. So it's important to understand both, and we'll certainly go through a little bit of that today. Small to medium-sized businesses need to learn exactly what security controls they've selected and determine if they are the most appropriate for their particular environment. Sometimes we build security controls or we select security controls because of a particular issue. And once we select that security control, we put it in place, but if we don't do that within the context of all risk that is imposed upon a particular infrastructure or asset, then we may be missing out on reducing risk in a more effective way. And we'll see that in going through the process that I'll describe, you can actually identify risk in areas that are highest and how you can reduce that risk most effectively. Where to start? Well, a lot of organizations certainly can't start from the beginning. They have security controls that are already in place. They've selected those, and honestly, they're probably working quite well. However, if you don't build that security program around it, you may have selected a security control that's not necessarily effective in reducing the most risk posed to a particular organization or asset. So we can start from the beginning if that's a luxury. A new organization who's building out a new infrastructure and has to go through this thought process. That's nice, but in most cases we're going to see that you have existing organizations who have been working for quite a long time, and they're getting to the point of their maturity where they really need to address security. So where do they start? What security controls do they select? How do they implement these security controls? And how do they measure their effectiveness once implemented and over time? Naturally, we'll take a look at that. Some of the problems that exist today in existing security management programs are that you have a lot of solutions that are based on just a collection of point solutions. You've selected a security control that is appropriate for one particular problem. However, if it's not done in the context of that security program, again, you may be missing out on something that might be more effective. Full implementation of a best security practice framework may not be a luxury or may not have been done in the past. And it also takes quite a bit of resources to do that. So is that appropriate for all organizations? I would say not. But understanding exactly what that framework entails and how you select security controls from that framework to address particular risk in your organization is quite important. Oftentimes we see that organizations that are governed by regulatory agencies have to comply with various regulations and law. So they invest in particular security controls to ensure that they are compliant with any type of regulation. Unfortunately, this doesn't lead necessarily to a secure environment. It just leads to a compliant environment. You want to make sure that you address both, and a security program will help you do that. And oftentimes, if there's no executive involvement, we see that the security program is implemented by a security team or an IT team, and it's really not done at the highest level where executives understand risk much better and return on investment much better than other individuals in the organization. And when I talk about return on investment, a lot of people talk about security and return on investment and how they really can't see that. Our return on investment here is a reduction in the risks that is posed to an organization. And we'll see exactly how we actually achieve that. Let's talk a little bit about the process. The process really starts with the identification of risk. Once you identify that risk, you determine exactly how you're going to handle each risk. And we do that through a risk mitigation plan. Some risks you will find are going to be too high, and you cannot accept them at the levels that they are posed to the organization or a valuable asset. So we need to select and apply various security controls to reduce that risk. And we do that by looking at a best practices framework or standard, in my opinion, to determine exactly what security controls are going to be best for your organization. If you are governed by regulation and you will have to apply regulatory requirements, we can overlay those regulatory requirements into your best practices framework. So now you have a good understanding of the relationship between those regulations, the security controls you've selected, and the best practices framework. And once we have an understanding here, we can plan those security controls, implement them, and then monitor them. One thing that you will find is a risk management program and the information security management program are living programs. They need constant attention, whether it be in a large enterprise or a small business. Naturally, it's the level of formality that is different in those particular environments. But you do need to routinely review the threats and security controls posed to a particular organization to ensure that you stay on top of things and that you are reducing risk appropriately within the organization. Now a little bit on more about risk management. The first thing we need to determine is what is important to a particular organization. What is valuable to that organization? And oftentimes it may be the information that you're processing, it may be intellectual property. There's many different things that are important to particular organizations, but some ways of determining what is most important to an organization, and sometimes these things change over time. Take a look at the corporate charter and the mission statement for the organization. That should provide you with a lot of clues on what's important to the organization. Take a look at your annual goals and objectives. Oftentimes you may have a very tactical goal for the 1 year and then grow into larger strategic goals in the out years. How do you ensure that you achieve that particular goal? Sometimes, in understanding these goals, will determine exactly what you're going to protect and how you will protect it within your infrastructure. Naturally, we have to look at the infrastructure and determine exactly what assets are of most value to a particular organization. What servers are processing my intellectual property or storing my intellectual property? Who has access to that property? How is that information transmitted inside and outside the organization? So I need to know where the critical data is, what systems process, store, and transmit that data, so I understand exactly where to concentrate security controls to best protect that information and those assets. And assets can be information, it could be hardware, software, intellectual data, intellectual property, customer information, privacy information, things like that. Once we identify the risks, now we need to determine exactly what type of, or I should say threats, what type of risk is posed to an organization. And we take a look at each threat, and we then determine what the likelihood of occurrence of that threat is. Naturally, the higher the likelihood of occurrence, the more risk is going to be posed to the organization. But If there's no impact to a particular threat being realized, then your risk isn't necessarily that great. So 3 variables to this formula: threat, likelihood of occurrence, and impact will determine the level of risk to a particular organization for a particular threat. So again, what are those assets valuable to the organization, and what's the likelihood of occurrence? You need to figure that out. And then you need to determine, well, what's the impact? And impact could be impact to the mission. It could be impact to business goals. It could be damage to reputation or your customer base. It can be a breach of customer data or privacy data or intellectual property. It could be the failure of being able to actually transmit or process financial transactions. So there's a lot of things that you need to figure out to determine exactly what the impact of the realization of a particular threat might be. A little bit more about risks. Again, we talked about this earlier, but risks and the analysis of risk is a continuous process. It's not something you're going to stop. As your business grows or as your objectives grow, you need to continuously assess risk to determine exactly what you need to do with that risk. Does something need to be done? So do you need to reduce that risk or do something else with that risk? We'll go over 2 methods of risk analysis, quantitative and qualitative methods. Now, there's a lot to these methods, but we'll go over them so you understand the different methods and how they might be applied in different environments. The quantitative method really attempts to calculate risks and monetary value. So how much would this risk in dollar value pose to a particular organization? And we'll see exactly how they derive that particular monetary amount. And then for the quantitative method, what we do is, or qualitative, excuse me, we actually weigh, categorize, and prioritize that risk. This is done in a lot of different environments. A lot of people prefer the qualitative method over the quantitative method because it can be done and oftentimes much quicker and can give you a relative information or idea of exactly what risks are higher, what risks are lower, and which ones need to be addressed first. Let's take a look at an example for quantitative methods. Here in this example, we talk about a threat of unauthorized disclosure of customer financial data. I also need to call your attention to some of these definitions and formulas at the upper right hand of the slide. We talk about loss expectancy, which is loss due to a single occurrence of a threat. Rate of occurrence is the number of times the threat is expected to occur. We annualize that rate of occurrence to get that in an annualized term. And then we use our formula, loss expectancy times annual rate of occurrence equals the annualized loss expectancy. So in this example is threat of unauthorized disclosure of customer financial data. We use the formulas above, and then we estimate the levels of risk. So we take a look at, let's say we determined that in determining loss of business due to damaged reputation, the cost of recovery, the loss of productivity, loss of revenue because of system unavailability, possible damage to a particular asset, we calculate that at $200,000. And then we determined that the annualized rate of occurrence is only once every 5 years or 0.2 times per year. Well, we can expect a loss of $40,000 each year based on this particular threat. We understand this and we go through this formula to determine that if I'm to apply a particular security control to reduce this risk, then how much should I be investing? Do I want to invest $1 million security control to save or protect myself for an annualized loss of $40,000? Probably not. So we want to make sure that we go through this process to understand the financial ramifications to losses, threats, and the security controls we select for those. The qualitative method. Let's take a look at the same threat. We have the threat of unauthorized disclosure of customer financial data. Well, we can measure the seriousness of the threat, and we'll do that on a scale of 1 to 10. You can use different scales if you'd like. There's no set, I guess, scale or range that you can use, but it probably is best to determine exactly how many assets you have in your organization, how many threats are posed to a particular organization, and that will help you in determining how wide of a range you need. But for small organizations, 1 to 10 is going to be fine. So we apply that to seriousness of the threat, likelihood of the occurrence, and the impact of that threat. And then we ask various people, we'll call them a risk management committee member, exactly what they believe the seriousness of the threat, likelihood of occurrence, and the impact of that threat is. And we use them or ask them to weight this on a scale of 1 to 10. Sure enough, the first member indicates the seriousness of the threat is a 7, the second member a 5, the third member a 7. Well, I can average these scores out and come out with a composite score for this particular threat. In doing this in each of the categories, I can then either multiply or add these numbers together. I like to add them so that I know that my threat is 19.9 out of a possible 30 of weighting. So if I have another threat that is then measured at 22 as opposed to 19.9, I probably want to look at that higher threat to do something about before I do something here. And I want to do it in a way that's commensurate with the level of the threat and the level of that composite score. So here I think you've seen the difference between the qualitative and the quantitative method. The quantitative method deals with monetary values, and this more is a weighting and a prioritization of those particular threats and risks. Now that I understand exactly and I have these risks associated with my particular organization or valuable assets, what do I do with these risks? Well, there's several methods that you can use to determine what to do. First one is I can decide to avoid the risk. For example, let's say an organization, retail company, they develop a product and they just send that out to distributors. They really don't sell directly to consumers. Then they decide they want to sell directly to consumers off a website. So they go through a thought process. That's a change in business model. And to accommodate that change in business model, what they do is they actually go through this risk thought process. What type of security controls would I have to put in place to conform with the payment card industry standards? What is the potential loss associated with this particular risk in getting into a new line of business or changing my business model? Oftentimes, or sometimes, they may determine that this risk is just too high to accept, and they can't remediate it. The cost to remediate it is too great, so they may avoid it or delay it. So you can avoid risk. You can also transfer risk. An example of transferring risk is getting an outsourcer to provide this service for you, somebody who might specialize in this environment. And through contractual obligations, what you do is you transfer that some of the risk associated with a breach or some type of issue when it comes to security to that outsourcer. So at least they are sitting there and they're suffering the recovery from a security breach or the monetary losses associated with that security breach. That has to be in contract, but that contract can actually transfer the risk or some of the risk from your organization to another. Naturally, there's some risk, like loss of reputation, that you are not going to be able to transfer. That's something you're going to have to live with and figure out exactly how you remediate that in potentially other ways. You can accept the risk. Organizations, businesses, by definition, are risk takers. And you need to determine, each organization needs to determine what their tolerance is for particular risk levels. So, they can accept risks based on their level of tolerance. And then we mitigate risk. And this is where the Information Security Management Program comes in. We need to determine how to reduce risk by the application of security controls. And we'll see how to build this Information Security Management Program to mitigate and maintain risks at lower acceptable levels. And then naturally, not to be emphasized enough, you need to continuously monitor those risks. Now about the Information Security Management Program. Remember, we're sitting there, we're mitigating the risks that we've identified because they are far too high to accept. So how to start this? We actually select the best practices framework, and there's several of them that you can select. Some of them are actually required. For example, NIST and CISA is required for federal agencies, but there's other organizations that may have the luxury in deciding exactly what framework they want to use. All these frameworks really try to apply a best practices approach to security. And the important thing is that, there are some that are better in other environments than others, but you'll see that there's so much overlap in all these frameworks that selecting and applying one is going to help you out tremendously. Once we select that best practices framework, we'll ensure that the regular requirements are addressed. We'll implement those security controls to protect our critical data. Again, we have to determine the value of your information. What type of data do you actually process in the organization? If you have different types of data, you need to go through a data classification routine. What data is important and what data is not important? And the reason why you have to select that is you need to apply security controls over the more important data, because if you try to apply it to all data, you're going to be much more restrictive than you need to be, and that will increase your costs. It will also impact your business functionality. So apply your security controls in an appropriate way for that data that is more important to you than others. Now we also want to make sure that we identify those valuable assets. We talked about this a little bit earlier. What servers are processing my information, what storage, where that information is stored, how is it stored, is it going to be encrypted when it's at rest, is it going to be encrypted when it's transferred, are you dealing with that data appropriately when it is inside the infrastructure as opposed to outside the infrastructure. So you really need to go through this thought process to understand where you're going to be applying these security controls. And remember, security controls aren't necessarily just technical controls. They have to do with people, processes, procedures, policies, and it's a lot of these. Taking these security controls and making sure you apply all of these particular types of security controls will allow you to be and handle and maintain a more efficient information security management program. Let's talk about the security standards and frameworks. We can see, as an example, the ISO 27000 series. We also have FISMA and NIST required for all federal systems. We have Tobit. Tobit is used a lot for Sarbanes-Oxley. Sarbanes-Oxley selects COSO and Tobit. Tobit being, the IT framework. Some regulatory requirements you're going to want to overlay for these are payment card industry, Sarbanes-Oxley, Health Insurance Portability and Availability Act. Actually, I think it's Accountability Act. Graham-Leach-Bliley Act. So you want to make sure that you're addressing and satisfying these regulatory requirements when you're selecting and applying various types of security controls. And I believe the best way of doing that is understanding exactly where these two things intersect. Here is just a list of some of the key standards within the ISO series, 27000 series. The ones that are most appropriate for us are the first one, 27001, where we talk about the information security management systems. This is actually going to be updated this year, 2013, as well as the 27002, where these are a list of the security controls that you can select for implementation in your particular environment. And then we can talk about, and they have standards for security risk management, all very good documents to read. Unfortunately, you do have to pay for these documents, so you can go to the ISO committee and download those, but it will cost you. One of the important things to recognize about the ISO 27001-2 standards is the approach to plan, do, check, and act. This, for all practical purposes, is your information security management program. You got to plan the implementation of security controls after you select exactly which ones are most appropriate. You have to ensure that after you implement them, you actually maintain them and do what is necessary to maintain that particular protection infrastructure, if you will. You need to monitor them, and then you need to act on any particular type of activity or event of interest that might come out of this system. And again, this is a recurring process. You'll see that it is reiterative, closed loop, so you know that it is a continuous process. Here is just the structure of ISO 27002, 2005. We're not going to go into any of these. I just wanted you to take a look at the structure of the ISO standard itself and see all the areas of coverage that they have when selecting security controls. And you can see this is a pretty comprehensive list, and you can get into the various security controls within each of these areas. NIST is a government-owned body. It's National Institutes for Standards and Technology, and they develop an awful lot of documentation that I believe is very, very valuable to the private industry as well as the federal government and other government agencies. I've selected two here just to give you an example. You can go to NIST, and they have documents about bring your own devices, mobile devices, secured hardware components. Two that are very critical to our discussion today are the risk management framework and the security lifecycle approach. You'll see that on the upper right-hand side. And you'll see that, there are various steps in maintaining this risk management framework. You got to categorize your information systems. So this is where we determine what's valuable to the organization. We select those security controls. We implement them. We assess the value and the effectiveness of those security controls. Some things that don't necessarily do in the private organizations, but they definitely have to do this in federal organizations, is they have to authorize those information systems. Many call that approval to operate. But some executive organization or responsible party needs to authorize these information systems to operate. And naturally, you monitor your security controls. The list on the bottom right-hand side is just a list of the family of security controls that come with NIST 853. This is a comprehensive list. In fact, I think NIST is probably one of the more comprehensive lists that you can use to select security controls. They also have a sister document called 853A that you can use to actually assess the security controls that you put in place. So great documentation. If you read through this documentation, probably won't be excited about the documentation, but I do believe that you'll learn an awful lot and understand exactly how to apply and then measure various security controls within your environment. Tobit is more control objectives for IT, but it does have a lot of security controls in place. It has a capability maturity model measurement with the framework itself. This too you have to actually purchase, and I believe that ISACA, the Audit and Controls Group, is the professional association, is the one that came out with Tobit and maintains that. Tobit defines 17 IT-related goals, and then there are subordinate activities associated with each of those goals. Let's talk about overlaying regulatory requirements, and here's an example of one. Here we see that we have administrative safeguards associated with HIPAA on the left side of this particular table. And then on the right side, we have ISO 27002. And this is actually a mapping that I did several years ago. And what you do is you actually break down each of these particular documents into single requirements. And now that I have a requirement, I can then look through the other document in its total to determine exactly where there are related requirements. And then I sit there and I list those. You can have one requirement showing up in different types of requirements or multiple requirements. This is a many-to-many relationship, if you will. So here we see risk management and the administrative safeguards of HIPAA are related to risk assessment and treatment in the ISO 27002 standard. So you can go through this. This is just a snippet of that particular administrative safeguard. You can purchase a lot of these mappings off the internet. You can also, some may be free to download. So there is a wealth of information on the internet, but I would caution you that in going through this, a lot of this is subjective, and it may be related to your particular organization on how you translate or how you interpret one requirement as opposed to another. So you need to make it current and applicable to your particular environment. Now that I have this overlap and I understand exactly what regulatory requirements I have to comply with, and I've selected the best practices framework, what I then can do is I can plan and assess the security controls. Now, we can apply this to an organization that already has existing security controls. And to do this, we need to determine exactly how we're going to measure compliance for the implementation of a particular security control. And for the presentation today and this illustration, we're going to define 4 different levels. Are these best practices never met, sometimes met, usually met, or almost always followed? So we'll take a look at that, and this is the measurement that we will use and apply to evaluating the security controls in our organization based on, and in this example, we're going to use ISO 27002. So we define those level of maturity, and we try to determine what the current level of maturity is based on what your desired level of maturity is. You need to understand that not all security controls need to be optimized for every environment. You need to determine what is appropriate to your organization. Remember that that dollar value in the quantitative methods of risk analysis? Well, I don't want to be imposing, I may need some security control, but I don't need to have a very expensive, very effort-filled security control to apply to a low risk area or a medium risk area. It has to be appropriate for the business. Here is one tool that I've used in the past to measure gaps, gaps within the particular organization. If you take a look, this is out of ISO 27002, and it's under what they call Clause 5 security policy. And you can go through each of the questions on the left column in regards to security policy. Is there an approved formal documented security policy that is being followed throughout the organization? And we've measured that as a 2, and I think that was almost always followed. So in most cases, policies are being followed. So we measured that into 2. We see that some are measured at 3 and others at 2. And then after I get this list, I can actually measure, or I should say calculate a composite score. And the composite score in this case is a 2.25. Now that I have that composite score, we'll get back to that a little bit earlier or later and how we actually relate that to an overall security assessment. But once we do that, we plan the implementation of these security controls, or we improve the implementation of existing security controls. Understand your environmental issues. There may be things that are imposed upon you that might prevent you from actually using that particular security control. So do what's most appropriate for your organization. Assign qualified security professionals to actually do this. If you don't, you run the issue of potentially not selecting or implementing or maintaining a security control in its most effective manner. So maximize your investment in this security control and make sure that it's done. I have seen far too many organizations that have a plethora of security controls, technical security controls in place, and when you ask about the training these people go through to use and to manage these particular components, they don't have much. So they may be using just a subset of the capability of these security controls. And then we want to make sure that the security controls we select, that we institutionalize those. Educate your users, educate your administrators to make sure that they can keep these requirements and these security controls up to par, and that they will protect you from the risks that they were selected to protect you from. Build those policies, processes, procedures around the technical controls. Make sure you understand that it's people, policies, processes, procedures, and technology that all come together in an information security management program to protect your infrastructure. And then naturally you want to consider various security principles like a layered defense. Don't rely on one particular security control only to protect your infrastructure. If there is a failure of one level of security, you want to make sure you have something else that protects you. And this becomes more important the greater the risk is. And then naturally segregation of duties. You don't want an auditor who is auditing their own work. So you want to separate those particular functions. That's just one example. There are differing views. If you go through the organization, different people in the organization, based on their roles, are going to need different information about the status of a security management program. If you talk to technical professionals, they're going to need very, very technical information. They're going to need health and status information on all the security components. They're going to want to review things like firewall rule sets on a routine basis. You know, they're going to need a lot more technical information and a lot more specific information. But as you move up the chain of command, you will find that they're going to need less and less information, technical, detailed information, and more summary information. But that summary information needs to be pertinent to your particular organization and to things that are important to them. For example, once you get into the executive levels, they're going to want to make sure that we're talking about risk. And what is the risk to the business? Not necessarily the IT infrastructure, not necessarily one security control, but to the business itself. So you want to make sure that they get that information. Here is a dashboard. This goes along with that scoring that I had for IT security policy. I can actually go through all the clauses of ISO 27002, come up with composite scores for each of these particular areas. I can color code them for very quick digestion by, executives who can see that, I have some of these particular categories that are doing well, and they're in green. Some are doing okay, but still need improvement. They're in yellow, and others that definitely need some attention, and they're in red. I can then sit there and compare an overall score or scores in these particular categories to things that have been measured in the past, the last quarter, the last year. Are things improving or are they getting worse? And if they're getting worse, naturally you need to correct your deficiencies and make sure that you get on the other side of that improvement scale. So you want to routine review the risk management program. Getting back to risk management, determining and identifying the threats to the business, you should do that at least annually. Or again, if your business model changes, threats change. For example, let's say there's a zero-day exploit that comes out. In other words, you're alerted to a particular new vulnerability. There is no patch for this particular vulnerability, so you have to wait for a patch to come out. You're going to be exposed for that particular period of time. So what do you do in the interim? You need to address and put some type of, sometimes a temporary, security control in place until you can have a patch for that zero-day exploit. So you want to make sure that you're continuously thinking about risk and then naturally go through the entire program on an annual basis. It's going to take a lot less time to do it annually after you go through it the first time, so it's not going to be as onerous as going through it the first. And then naturally we're continuously monitor those threats. I think we gave an example of the zero-day exploit. For small to medium-sized businesses, I think it's very important to be familiar with how we think about risk and how we mitigate risk or control risk, transfer it, avoid it in a small business or an enterprise, a large enterprise. Understanding exactly what risk is to the environment and how to control that risk will certainly help you in selecting the security controls appropriate for your organization. Now, we talked a little bit earlier about a risk management committee, and I do recommend one for larger organizations, but naturally, when you get into medium to smaller sized businesses, a committee isn't necessarily appropriate or even possible. So a committee can be a committee of one, but you might want to take a look at your peers to go over some of your work or your thought processes and building or thinking about the information security management program. The ISMP is really associated with, and the formality of it is really dependent upon the risks to the organization, the size of the organization, the threats, what you can afford. So there's a lot of variables associated with that. You don't have to have an awful lot of paperwork associated with your ISMP, but you probably have to have a good investment in security policies, processes, procedures. You probably want to select the qualitative method of risk analysis because, you probably have fewer assets than a large enterprise. So you can relate various threats and risks, level of risks, in a relative way and select those that are most important to remediate first and then go down that list in priority order. There's a lot of technical security solutions out there. Be careful. Some are just designed for large enterprises. Others do very well in scaling from small enterprises to large enterprises. And then some are specifically developed for the small environment. So make sure you right-size your technical security controls. One of the most important things that I can share with you today is educating your staff members. Don't shortchange that security education. Make sure everybody understands what the threat to the business is and to potentially notice or identify particular threats or attempts to breach information. And then we talked about the formality of the program and how it depends upon various things in your organization. Summary, well, we want to talk about the information security management program. It has to be risk-driven. If there is no risk, there's no need for a security control. If there's a lot of risk, we better have a security control in place to mitigate that risk. Or you need to do something else with it. You can transfer it, avoid it. So there's definitely ways of handling that risk. And then we need to maintain it at acceptable levels. We need to monitor the threat landscape. It is continuously changing. You need to make sure you understand what that threat landscape is to your particular business. What is important to you? What could impact your business and functionality? So understanding that and keeping an eye on that will certainly help you in maintaining a strong information security management program. Select the framework and the best practices as a baseline, those that work for you and your organization. Again, you don't have to implement all security controls. You have to implement security controls that directly relate to the risk that is posed to your particular organization. Well, we've gone through the presentation, and now I'd like to tell you just a few words about risk, 6 dimensions. We do have numerous practices of concentration. I am the Director of Cybersecurity, but we also have practices in the Office of the CIO, which is our managed services organization. We do healthcare IT, EMR, Epic, a lot of Epic programming. We develop web applications, content management systems. We concentrate on both mobile and e-commerce applications. We do a lot in business intelligence and ERP. And we are an organization that wants to empower our people, and we want to make sure that they are the best that we can provide to our clients. Also with this presentation, we are launching a CSO Subscription Service. And what we mean by that is a lot of small to medium-sized organizations don't necessarily have the leadership, the security leadership in place. Building a full-blown implementation security management program will require you to hire people, bring them on board, and then operate and maintain that particular program. Well, we've developed a way where you can actually, for a monthly subscription, have on-call security leaders. We'll come in, we'll perform your risk analysis for you. We'll develop your key security policies, processes, and procedures. We'll perform a gap analysis to determine how your existing security controls are doing to reduce risk in your organization. And we'll develop a roadmap to make sure that security controls you have in place or security controls you need in the future are ensuring that your organization reduces and maintains that acceptable level of risk. We'll help you in providing technical security controls throughout the year, and we'll perform recurring security vulnerability assessments, penetration tests. We'll review your program in total and make sure that you're staying on track with that. And naturally, we're going to be a phone call away. You will call and get a dedicated individual who will provide you with those services, and you will have that dedication and of security leadership. With that, I'd like to answer any questions you may have. So let's go to the question and answer page, see if anybody has any questions.